Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love. I'm joined by Christy Kelly. Hello again, Christy. And our guest this week is R. Barbara Gitenstein, or should we say Rose Barbara or Robob. We'll get into all the names. Names are important in this conversation. She is the president emerita of the College of New Jersey, and the author of Experience is the Angled Road, a memoir of an academic. Barbara, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's good to have you. And like I said, the names, in your introduction, you kind of talk in framing why you wrote the book. You talk about, both your name and the moniker of others in your family. So talk about why you wrote the book and why that was important, that, and then we'll get to some of the other things that you lead to there.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point about the naming really matters. What you are called is who you are, how you see yourself. And I was named, I'm Jewish, and I was named in the Jewish tradition for my grandmother, my father's beloved mother. And I always felt her shadow over me. Her name was Rose. And I didn't want to be her. So early on in the South, when I grew up in the South, I was called Rose Barbara. Double names, which isn't unusual in the South. And as I got older, I moved to Barbara. And then my brother, I'm very close to my older brother, started calling me Robob, and that became Bobby. And that's how my name and my identity moved.
Right. So you had Rose Barbara, Robob, right, and Bobby, right? So many. And then you also tell a story about sitting your kids down and telling them that, what would you think about me going to changing your name? Because I'm assuming your husband's Don Hart, you had lived as Hart, Barbara Hart, for years.
Well, actually, it was interesting. I had sort of a dual identity.
Private,
I
had a work name.
I had a work name, which was Gitenstein.
Okay.
And then I had my home name, my family name, which was Hart. And it just got too confusing and it was ridiculous. And I realized I never thought of myself as Barbara Hart. So I decided to officially change my name back. At that point, we had 2 children.
Right.
And I sat down at dinner one night to try to explain to them what I was going to be doing and for them not to be worried that it didn't mean anything, that it had no signification.
Right.
And they go, but isn't that your name?
Right. That's
They
funny.
responded, I thought your name was Gitenstein.
Right. That's funny. Barbara, Wilfred Riley, Barbara Gitenstein.
Pleasure to meet you.
Sometimes there are technical difficulties. Wilfred, you're on mute. In case I don't want Barbara to think you were rude and you didn't say hi back. So.
Great to meet you. I guess.
So before we get to what you wrote about and the interesting things in your story, I did want to mention one thing, and it's part of the story, but that I did find interesting to spend a little time on. So you already mentioned that you were Jewish. You also briefly noted that you lived in the South. So not just the South, a wee tiny little real South, like a wee
real South
little town named for just, I guess, just where you are. You're close to Florida. You're in Alabama, so. What is it? Florala? They would probably.
Florala.
That's how
exactly.
they pronounce it. So you talk about that and some of the experiences you had, and I wanted to talk a bit about that. As I mentioned that to you earlier, that I wrote this piece about the South, and so I wanted you to talk a bit about that. Obviously, this was a different time because this was decades ago, but obviously there's challenges there. Probably still are. They were much worse then, but. Talk about what that experience was like, because the way you wrote about it in the book, it was pretty honest. You talked about some things that you saw that were bad, that were racist, some comments about your ethnicity, but at the same time, there were also moments where you assumed something bad would happen, like and it didn't. And I thought about that juxtaposed to 60 years later, people are like still that I know from the North, afraid to go to the South because they think that, something bad will happen. So talk a bit about your experience there.
Well, it was very strange to grow up in the circumstance that I did. It was a very small town. It's a town of 2,000. My family was one of maybe three, maybe four Jewish families in the county, not the town, in the county. And the town, we were at one point the only Jewish family. And my father owned the shirt factory that employed many of the people in the town. So that was another reason to be different and to be set aside, not to be really part of the community. Because of my father's position, there was less overt anti-Semitism than there would be under other circumstances. But there were clear attitudes of discomfort with us, and particularly with our attitudes, because my parents were from the North. My parents were from Manhattan, and we had particular attitudes that they brought with them from the North, and that they just had with them inside themselves with regard to race relations. And one of my most powerful memories of just how that played out was when my sister was graduating from 8th grade. And her class was the first class that was integrated in our town. And it was time for the party for the end of the year. And all the family says, "Oh no, we can't have the party. But no, there will not be an end of the year party, because there'll be Black children there as well as white children." And my mother said, "Oh yes, there will." And so she actually hosted the party for that 8th grade class. What struck me most particularly about that was that at the time my mother employed two women, African-American women, who worked in the house. And one of them was a much older woman, and she was terrified. For the entire party, she hid out in the laundry room. And I remember thinking how awful that was. But I understood why she felt that way. But I thought how awful that she felt that way. And of course, everything in point of fact went fine, and the party was fine, and people acted like human beings. But even so, that history of trauma and that fear was very real to her. And she would do what my mother asked, but then she would hide.
Right. Christy, you said you were going to say something about your experience of your time in the South.
Yeah, so I randomly ended up in the South right before COVID and during COVID for about 4 years, 4-year stretch there. And the entire time while I was there, my father would not come visit me. So it was Meridian, Mississippi, and he would not come. And it's just kind of those, ghosts of what the South was. Now, as a child, he did, go back and forth to the South a little bit, but he was prohibited from his family from going there because he didn't behave like quite all the other cousins. So, there were certain rules, like he didn't really understand. No, you can't go in the lower level of the movie theater, or there's some restaurants you could, coming from Ohio going down to the South. And they were like, you know what? We're not sending you back there no more. And so I think it's just, because they just knew that he wasn't going to, act in code with what was supposed to be at that time. But I tried to tell him, I was like, Dad, this is the new South. It's, I loved it. We probably would have stayed in the South, probably not Mississippi, probably like Tennessee, but families on the West Coast. So we had to come back. But I absolutely love the South now, right? But he would, but he would not come. He would not step foot in Mississippi.
But I can understand that sense of the burden of history. Maybe 12 years ago, my husband and I took a trip to Eastern Europe, and my husband started referring to the trip as a trip to 6 countries where Jews would never want to live. We went to Poland, we went to Germany. And there really was that feeling of of the history of the events that were there, even though all of my family had already immigrated to the United States decades before.
Right.
But I'm just saying I can understand that.
Right. Oh, were you done? I didn't want to cut you off.
Yeah.
You were done. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I get that too. So my knock isn't against that, especially to Christy's father. I wouldn't have much to say about that. He's older, his time with living there. Even if you talked about, living there and talked about experiences that you had that weren't positive, right? I mean, obviously you lived there long enough that all of your experiences weren't going to be negative. You would have positive and you would have negative ones. And that history is real for them. But, to you, Will, you down in Kentucky, right? And you kind of we talk about this often. And my concern is not the burden of the past or what has been, but kind of how people like your Barbara's husband said that, this is when he went on that trip 12 years ago, that history is still so strong. People think of it that so many people in the North, and Barbara, you mentioned that's the case too, have this misconception. So they talk about how things are so much better here. In fact, it's not just a knock against the South. It's a way, I look at it as a way for people in the North to make themselves feel better, right? They'll say, well, at least we're not Mississippi, at least we're not Alabama. And one, that's not really true. So there's still, even in 2024, exists racial issues there, but there are racial issues in New York City. Right.
Well, absolutely. Look at the history of slavery in New York City.
Right. So you had that, but also, there's that one. I don't know who to attribute it to. The thing that people used to say that in the South, no one cared how big you got as long as no, how close you got as long as you didn't get too big. And in the North, no one cared how big you got as long as you didn't get too close. So it was kind of like in the South, you could live among, whites or whoever's there being a black person, as long as you understood, your place. But in the North, you could become a doctor and everybody would treat you fine as long as you stayed in the black neighborhood while you were being a doctor. So the fact that people in the North still believe that that's the case in 2022, 3, and 4 seems odd. And I'm assuming that is not your experience in Appalachia.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of different things. So first of all, in Appalachia, I mean, like the near slavery poverty involved entirely white people. So I mean, that's like there are a lot of different levels of, oppression and historical conflict. Like, I mean, the guy singing "I Owe My Soul to the Company Store" or Tennessee Ernie Ford was a white dude.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like in Kentucky, I've gone to some of the museums where they show like the plastic money they used in the old mines and the starving kids and so on. And it's sort of similar for me to what going to a museum depicting a pogrom might be like, because it's just one of those historical atrocities, but it doesn't have anything to do with black people. It's kind of like the Trail of Tears Museum, which I've been to. I mean, the only black people depicted there are the slaves, which actually is another interesting level of history. Natives didn't especially like African Americans; they thought of them as more violent incomers. But in regions of the South where there is a lot of integration, like Louisville, going down into Tennessee, going down into Georgia, today, I mean, I see substantially less racial conflict than I do in the North. So I think that there are levels to that. Like, one, down here, the schools actually, by the time you got through the 70s, did integrate. I mean, you don't want to make jokes like both groups knew how to fight, but there wasn't the massive flight away that you saw in a lot of northern cities. So, I mean, I teach in some inner city schools down here. Like, I've taught in downtown Frankfurt, I've taught in Louisville, although not extensively. I didn't teach through a year in those schools. But I mean, like, you just see black and white kids going to school. Like, they date each other. They're friends. You don't see that as much in northern cities. So, like, the picture of constant racial conflict every day is probably less true in a large southern city, like a working class Atlanta neighborhood, than it would be almost anywhere else. And I guess, like, if I have a point here, it would be just understand that the narrative you have in your mind about almost any place is very often kind of the picturesque point in the past that place is known for. And it often has very little to do with what that place looks like now. Like, if you went to Paris today, and I'm not racist in either direction. I don't, if this is really good or bad. 1 in 4 people you saw would be of Arabic descent or Eastern European. It's a world city. I mean, you'd see tech bros walking around, feminist women with blue hair writing poetry on computers. It would look like New York City or Chicago, just a bit bigger if you extend to the full scope of the city. So the idea that Frenchmen in berets smoking cheroots, that's not what would
That's not
actually
what
be
you'll see.
happening. Yeah,
But
so I mean, it's the same thing here. Last line, I guess. So remember that the present is different from the past, and I guess don't let your perceptions of the present be controlled by the past. If you see racism, point it out, so on. But I mean, don't assume the South is black and white men fighting with clubs. France is 100% Caucasian, so on down the line. I've had almost no experiences with constant ethnic conflict in the South. The only times I've heard the N word or negative terms for whites in near physical conflict, actually, recent past, have been when I went back to Chicago and playing basketball and that type of thing, or just walking around in the streets. Homeless people, I mean, so on down the line.
Wilfred, I get you. I would also point out that even back in the times that you're referencing as the past, it wasn't as simplistic as
Of course, of course.
people were painting it. For instance, we actually, in that small town, lived with Blacks.
Mhm.
There was a daily interaction with people that was not true in the North.
Right. That's the
I
point.
mean, there were segregated communities in a way that they were not segregated. I mean, there were different living areas in the city, but if you're talking about just the day-to-day experience, I would suspect that even in the 50s in Florala, Blacks and whites saw one another and interacted with one another more than they would have in New York City.
And that's important to say. I'm gonna say this
Actually,
last thing because I got to get back to the book. Go ahead,
if I
brother.
could say one thing there, though, actually, as a social scientist, I think that's a really important point because historical systems very often worked. And I think we can hold two things in mind at the same time. Like, one, if a system was very bad for a lot of people, it's good we got rid of it. But two, the idea that the people in the past were living in sort of constant hell, like at eternal war with one another, that's not true. Like, when I've talked to older women in my family about what male and female roles were like in the past, what they'll say is sort of, well, it's very good, obviously, now that all jobs are open to both groups of people. But I mean, they'll sort of joke, like, yeah, your grandfather, I ran the house. He'd come home with money, I'd take it from him, I'd pay the bills, I'd do this. Like, it was expected if you were a competent man that you'd work your job and I'd play this role. There were organizations for men and women. Perhaps I was in the junior league or the black equivalent. He'd have his bowling club or whatever. There was an established set of social rules for males, females, I'd assume for the different races, even ethnicities, the Italian American, this or that. And this entire world of social roles that existed functioned reasonably well. If we said, well, the racism that exists between these groups or even between these subgroups of the same race, that's bad. We've had enough. We're going to get rid of it. I think that's overall a good move. But yes, the pre-existing society in the South, every time a black and a white person saw each other, there wasn't vicious conflict. They lived side by side for 100+ years. And I think we kind of forget that. The idea is that there were lynchings every day. And so I know there were 5,000 lynchings all time, and 1,000 of them involved white people. Yeah, that's an excellent point.
And then the one thing I was going to say to add to that is the time frame from the North to South. Obviously, we're talking 50s and 60s. Well, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I'm from Gary, Indiana, and I could go all day in elementary school and not see a white person. And that was in the 70s and 80s. Now, there were a couple teachers and things like that, but I could walk around, go into the local store, go here, go play basketball, go hang out with my friends and never see a white person. Yep. So, and that's the North, right? So, I mean, yeah, you can't make everything so simplistic. And what racism still exists in the South, the best way to fix it is to go there, call it out, hang out with friends, and make them see different things. If you stay away, you stay in the North and stay in your bubble, then you're perpetuating the segregation that you're saying you have a problem with. But
I also would point out that, Alabama, which is the state that I know the best in the South, because I lived there for the early part of my life, there have been some remarkable things that have happened with regard to race relations in Alabama, positively. If you look at some of the developments in Montgomery recently with regard to the several museums, it's quite remarkable.
Right.
It's quite remarkable. And
Yep, yep. And so that's what's important. And I think people need to know that part too. They can know the ugly side, don't bury it, but you also need to know this too. That's all that I
Yeah,
thought
let me
was
say one more quick thing about that. I will say, having come from California going to Mississippi, I was scared, when I was like, okay, where can I not drive down? I got to be careful. And it took me a little bit to get used to this nice, friendly man in overalls with this Confederate flag, belt buckle, just
Yep.
talking to me, just having a normal conversation. And in my head, I'm like, you have to be racist because you have this big Confederate flag that you're wearing. And just learning that, okay, it's cultural for them. They're not racist and they don't think anything of it. I'm stuck on it and he's not thinking anything of it. He's probably forgetting that he's wearing it. So I experienced much more racism from police, from everything in California than I ever did the 4 years that I was in Mississippi.
Right, right.
And also,
Um,
even if bro is a bit racist, it's not like he is at all going to run to his pickup truck, pull out a gun, and attack you with it. I think everyone does this. As a very quick comment, I think whites do this in reverse with black areas as well. So, like, when I went down to Appalachia, it was very definitely my friends in Chicago, many of whom were black and Latino, were almost beyond being legitimately worried, sort of making jokes like, "Hey, you got a pretty mouth. That's the hills. That's a racist area. That's a high crime area." My friends down here have the same perception of Chicago, that it's African American and Italian guys like leaning out of SUVs, just shooting guns at random. If you walk down the street, there's actually a meme, a conservative guy that's scared of cities. It's like a costume and it's a picture of a guy with a shirt that says like US Army veteran and a Bass Pro Shop hat, and just a nice crew cut and all this stuff. And, the words, "I'm not scared, bro," coming out of his mouth. But that's a reference to all the content on social media where people are saying, "You wouldn't catch me in suburban Detroit without two guns on me." The idea that if you go where the other people are, you're going to be in serious danger is really common. And it's almost always wrong. Like if you spent a day in Watts or something for a film project, no one's going to murder you.
right.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean, when I was before I became president of the College of New Jersey, which is obviously in New Jersey, you can tell by the name of the figure that
surprise.
All
out.
right.
But you guys are smart.
Fair
But
enough.
I was in Iowa. I was at Drake University, and people said, "You're moving to New Jersey? Are you crazy?" And all they knew was 13A on the turnpike. I mean, that's all they knew. And they knew nothing else. I mean, there's a reason why it's called the Garden State. It's a beautiful state. It really is a beautiful state.
Right,
And so it's not just about the people, but it's about the geography and
right.
just the complete misunderstanding of other places.
Right. We got to get to Barbara's book. This is going to last. So no one can comment on my comment. That's the rule. But I got to give you one because of what Will said, and you mentioned your husband on your trip to Eastern Europe. So we went to Eastern Europe just before COVID at the end of 19. And you talk about perception. This is one of the saddest, if you think about, but one of the funniest story I had. So I'm leaving, and my son's like 3 at the time. My wife and my son and I are leaving this park, and we're at the corner at the light, waiting for the light to change. And the guy, so we were in, I want to say, we were in probably Prague. So a guy looks over at us and barely speaking English, he looking at you, he's like, "Oh, where are you from?" And we say, "Chicago." And he goes, "Phew, phew." I'm not making that up. He just did the guns and start laughing and crossed the street in Prague because I said Chicago. That's how bad Chicago's reputation is. But to your book, Barbara, I got to ask you, before we run out of time and I don't get to everything, I got to ask you. So, is there something special about your family, or by that respect, uh, Florala, that everybody writes letters? How do you have all these letters from everybody? And then my mom wrote a letter, and then I started writing letters, and then my dad wrote. He didn't write letters as well. He was better on the
No, he
phone, but
didn't.
he did write me letters. And then my brother Mark. I mean, even the family, your parents, your surrogate parents, Georgia and Matt. Just how is it that everybody you knew wrote
But
letters?
well, back then, more people did write letters,
I mean, but not everybody.
but I don't know that I'm just a pack rat, so I kept all the letters that people
Right.
wrote. And if you've read the book, you know the point at which I realized how important those letters were was when
Your
I
mom's.
found the packet of letters from my mom.
Yep.
And it brought her back to me from my repression of her memory because she had Alzheimer's.
Right.
For me, it was the power of the word. And what's also, I think that's always going to be around. But what I think is very sad is nowadays, people no longer write, handwrite anything. And all of these, most of these letters, except the letters from my father, were handwritten. So you get that extra pleasure of not only the words of your loved one writing to you, but their handwriting. And you could actually see what they had written. And it's a beautiful and moving experience.
Right.
I'm very
Yeah,
glad.
that was just one thing that captured me. Not the fact that, you reference a couple letters and you talk about what you learned from people, but there was just so many. Then it was another one. Then this person, I'm like, my God, everyone this woman knows wrote long letters on a regular. Did they do anything else? Did anybody make the shirts, Christy? Because they were all just writing letters. So like, time to make shirts. So that was interesting. But you start basically the whole point of the book, it kind of tricks you. People think, a former college president, we're in trying times, you're going to give us these lessons of leadership and what they should do. But really, you're talking about what you learn by the people in your closest relationship, and in some cases, what not to do by watching people. But so you talk about that. And one of the things, since we're just coming off of talking about the South, one thing I found, obviously your mother's dementia we'll get to, but one thing interesting about your mother was how you framed her as being really fair and honest. You talked about your peers. She cared about equality. She wasn't a racist. She cared about that stuff. But she would be weird in today's society because she was also steeped in tradition. Right.
Very.
So she would say blacks need equal rights, but she had a problem with the way they protested sometimes.
Exactly.
Right. See, so talk a bit about how how that shaped you, and you were able to both see how to treat people with compassion and fairly and respectfully, but at the same time, she just thought there were certain things, like she was also like a true Southerner. Like there's certain things you're supposed to do in polite society, and you're not supposed to do.
She believed in propriety and in the rules of the society that she found herself in, which was of course not the society she was born in. She moved there, and so a lot of those rules that she picked up on were rules that were from the South, that were not from her experience from living in metropolitan New York. But I think part of that too, Charles, was her desire to fit in.
Mm-hmm.
She wanted to be seen as a lady of the South, and she wanted to be seen as proper. And so therefore there were certain rules that she couldn't abide being broken, because it would imply that she didn't understand how to act.
Right.
And I had to learn which of those were false rules and which of those were rules of morality.
Mm-hmm.
Because she genuinely did feel in compassion and understanding for people from different paths. She did. But she was not pleased with me for any number of reasons. I mean, not just weight was one of them, of course. A lot about that.
Right.
But also my choices in relationships. I mean, not just Don, but when I was in college, I dated a number of black guys, and she was not happy with that.
Right. Chrissy, well, anything you want to add? Anything come to mind?
Not right at that point now.
Okay. And then you write about your dad, and so I was kind of like both about the I get why products and manufacturing is cheaper. That's why you're going there. But that really small town, it seemed weird that the factory was there. But it was the interesting part about your dad. I mean, you write about the temper and how he would get upset about certain things, but also how he was truly tied to the city, and how he liked being there, and he liked being important. He liked helping employees. He liked people, like giving them that nod and being, an important person in that society. So talk a bit about what you took from that.
Well, he liked very much being the big fish in the small pond. He liked that very much, and he liked being admired and seen as a city father. But he also liked as being in a safe because he was able to, because of his position, he was able to protect people from criticizing what everyone knew about him, which was that he was gay. And that was, that was something that was a great secret that he never even revealed until he was in his 80s.
Right.
To me.
Right. Wow. Yeah.
And it was something that, of course, mattered not at all to me. I mean, he was my father, and with all his faults, I adored him, and I didn't care.
And
I did not get to that part of the book, so you'll have to tell us, how did he reveal that to you?
So when he was 85, no, 90, or maybe 88, he broke his hip, and he ended up in a nursing home, which he'd always said he would never live in a nursing, but he ended up living in one in Florala because he couldn't leave Florala. That's where his identity was.
Right.
And I would visit him. And one time during a visit, he turns to me and, he says, Bobby, talking about how the situation wasn't so bad in the nursing home. And I had a conversation yesterday with one of the local preachers. I can't remember whether it was the Methodist or the Baptist preacher, who would often visit him, always hoping that they could convert him. They held on for 95 years. He never did, but and he said how much he enjoyed that. And then he said, in sort of a covered kind of way, and I like men. I said, oh.
And have a nice day.
I mean, just like that. And so after a while, I sort of let it sink in, and I asked him again. He said, oh, I didn't mean that.
Right.
But clearly he did. And
he was presumably bi, but that's
exactly. But
it's a good way to come out if you're going to do it, I think.
At 88 at the nursing home.
Yeah, no, but just quiet and elegant. You tell your beloved daughter, yes, and by the way, I've always liked boys as well. And then you say, believe it or not, and then you move on with your life. What remains of it? Well done, I think.
What was really interesting, I was very touched that he told me of the children. I was very touched by that.
Well, it kind of, and not to skip to the Alzheimer's, but I was kind of struck as to why you were the one to take the keys away. Like, why did he entrust you? So maybe that's you guys'
same reason. I think for the same reason. I'm the middle child, but I'm the elder daughter. And I was supposed to be the one that did the hard stuff. I was supposed to be the one that was the grown up. I was supposed to be the one that was supposed to take care of people. And I took on that role, and probably, relished it. But also there were burdens. I mean, and it was that, Christy, that made it so hard for me to deal with my mother's decline, and why I actually had to erase her as a memory, which is a terrible thing to do. A terrible thing to do.
So you talk about, again, these relationships, me, mom, family, your sister, your brother, how all of these shaped you, but then you move on to professional relationships, friends, professional relationships, mentors, people who guided you, and people so talk about how you learned from somebody's experience. I mean, there was the guy that briefly, there was the one, Ron M.
Oh yeah,
who said, oh yeah, she was just telling me how my son was my oldest son or youngest son was an idiot, and then the philosophy chair who came in, spewing saying something about that nigger needs to do whatever else, and then saying whatever. So you have all these, kind of these frictional things, and then you move around and you find these people that well, so you got those bad, all bad. Then you have some that were really great. They were shockingly, wonderful. And then the one I liked was the one that was kind of in the middle. Who was it? Virginia Radley, the one you said was kind of your reason to go there, but she was kind of manipulative. You had a fight because she was trying to force someone there. But that's the one person you actually had to line. I learned a lot from her about how to be a college president, mostly by learning what not to do. And you talk particularly about how she handled a rape allegation at the school. Tell that story.
So Virginia was the first female president of any SUNY campus. And, there are many 64 campuses. I guess there's still 64. There were at that time, at any rate. And she was the first female president of any of the campuses. And she was notorious for carrying a gun in her purse, actually. I don't know why she did, but she did. At any rate,
you never know when you might have to shoot someone.
Apparently, apparently, if you're a college president, it's tempting. I'll have to say. At any rate, at Oswego, fraternities did not have houses on the campus, but there were houses in the town that were owned by the fraternities. And there was an allegation of a gang rape at one of the fraternity houses. And Virginia found out about it. And she contacted the vice president for student affairs, and she said, expel them all the young men, expel them all. She didn't go through any process. She just said, expel them all. And a good friend of mine, who at the time was the general counsel, contacted her afterwards and said, Virginia, you can't do that. You got to go through a process. I mean, there's got to be some kind of due process here. She said, I didn't tell you because I just knew it would upset you.
So the reason, what struck me,
anyway, they got reinstated, of course, as you might suspect.
Well, stop. You said they got reinstated. Of course, that's what's interesting to me. And I want to spend some time, obviously talk about the book, but talk a bit about some challenging things you face in college and what you see has changed in academia since you left, because it's interesting you say that, because obviously you had a problem, whether you don't want guilty rapists on your campus, but you're saying that there's a process. But I think of what was Casey Johnson's book, the campus race frenzy, yes, where he talked about how a lot of colleges got to the point after around Me Too where they would just suspend people or expel students, not allow them to defend themselves, and facial accusation, all that kind of stuff. So it was kind of poignant to have you talk about that experience, and obviously saying you learned how not to handle that, where I don't know if that Herbert's reaction would be frowned upon today. Do you think?
Oh, yes, it would.
You think so?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Sure, it would. Now, the question is whether it would be legitimate process or not. That's another question.
They have something in place, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, I think nobody could have done what she did back then today. Right. But most campuses have some kind of process that's required when there's, I mean, Wilfred, you're on a campus, right? And you must know about that, such processes. And sometimes they are well handled and sometimes they are not well handled.
Right, right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the kind of default position among a lot of conservative academics is to view the Title IX campus process as sort of a kangaroo court. In practice, I mean, I think it varies from university to university.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Right.
I couldn't agree with you more.
And as most things,
so it's not the Title IX office that's the problem. It's who's in the Title IX office.
Right. That's like anything else, right?
And also, I would submit, it's who's sitting in the president's office.
Right. Right.
Who will tell the person in the Title IX office what to do and how to handle it.
Definitely true. Good leadership plays a big role there. Good leadership plays a big role in almost everything, obviously.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
As a lawyer by background, although not practicing, I think another thing, a personal opinion of mine also, is that when actual serious crimes are involved, a lot of that should be turned over to the police force, to the local DA, so on, in the first place. I mean, if you actually think there's been a series of rapes on campus, I don't necessarily think the university Title IX office is really the entity that should be in charge of that. So I think very often when there's a focus on handling that through university channels, you're not talking about what would traditionally legally have been considered violent rape. You're talking about these student domestic and relationship encounters that are being handled without a lot of the traditional legal protections in place, and that's where you run into a lot of the sort of right to defend yourself issues that people are complaining about. But I mean, my actual experience here has been sort of, you know, being part of 2 or 3 hearing boards, so it's not an area of expertise for me.
Right.
Yeah.
But to his
But still, I think it would be fair to summarize what you're saying is that it can be done in a fair way
without a doubt, yeah.
if there's the right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, I mean, I will say I don't necessarily think it generally is.
But
And that's there's some suspicion on my part simply because, I mean, most people aren't really trained to handle felony criminal cases if you're talking about a full-on rape investigation or something of that nature. And the university right now, as a guy who's on kind of the center right, leans of whatever it is, 91, 92% to the left. So I look at that with a fair amount of suspicion. But could you run something like that procedurally well at a university? Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
I think
could
if you,
do it.
if,
But I think there's a huge difference between, in most cases, certainly when you're seeing a pattern, most of those cases are after some kind of on-campus investigation turned over to authorities.
right. But let
Yeah,
me ask you this though. Oh, go
well,
ahead.
let me say that I used to work at an ombudsman's office at a university, and I think there has historically been, when the universities try to handle it themselves, it has been a sweeping under the rug that I don't think that we should ignore. I think that's getting better, right? But I definitely think when the university tries to handle it themselves, they historically have not done a sufficient job, especially with the date rape cases.
I couldn't agree with you more, and that's why I think to simply say turn it over to the police is not necessary, particularly when it's a date rape issue.
There's an entire question here actually about university discipline and how that should operate that it would actually be very interesting to discuss in some detail with you guys, but where you can really go wrong in one of 2 directions. So, I mean, I actually wrote the book Hate Crime Hoax, where I looked at hundreds of these cases where people made essentially totally fake allegations, primarily on the left, but actually some in both directions of, you know, attacks from, you know, vigilantes on the other side of the political aisle and so on. And the way that universities dealt with this was all across the map and usually bad. A very, very common response was to investigate this, essentially sort of find out that it was fake, and then kind of just stop investigating, allowing people outside the university to basically believe that the case might have some validity to it. It was never announced, you know, this did not happen. There were marches going on through the campus and so on.
Well, sometimes they can't announce it, as you know, because of FERPA. I mean, there are, you know, laws governing what kind of information you can share.
Sometimes they could, sometimes they couldn't have in these cases. But I mean, in the Title IX and date rape situations, I think that the main worry from everyone from legitimate conservatives to sort of men's rights activists is that very often you're not talking about really a traditional legal process at all. You're talking about a situation where, say, 2 students have both had 5 drinks and they hook up, quote unquote, they have sexual intercourse or do something similar. And several weeks later, a charge is brought, and you have a university process where you don't, I mean, thinking about most of the schools in Kentucky necessarily have a right to confront your accuser, so on down the line. And there are a number of disciplinary punishments that can result from that. You could be suspended, for example. You can be banned from the campus for a year. The argument is that you're not, and I'm pretty sympathetic to this, that you're not really receiving any kind of legal procedure whatsoever. There's this entirely separate university process. Could that be run fairly?
Well, I just want to quickly say, as bad as that
we're
is,
probably going to disagree on this. So.
right.
I suspect so, yeah.
But you mentioned something about leadership. So I mean, you were removed. I mean, you weren't there at the time. So I do wonder, like, what your thoughts on how college campuses, you know, and college leadership dealt with, you know, what happened on college campuses, especially here. We're both in New York. You know, the last the last month or two of the school year across all of our campuses here in New York City and across the country. But we saw it like in the city in 3 places all at one time. Like, what your thoughts are on how that was handled?
Well, for the most part, of the episodes that have made the most news.
Right.
Of course, those are not most of the episodes.
Right. But
They're only
NYU,
those-
Columbia.
No, I want to underline that because the
Right.
point is lots of stuff was happening on other campuses that went just fine.
Right.
Lots of protests.
Well, some kind of went
And-
bad
and-
the other way. Like I think Indiana University just cracked everybody over the head, drug them off. I think you would probably think that was bad too.
I would, but my point is, I think a lot of the presidents
Real bad.
did a poor job of handling those situations. Mostly, the problem began because they didn't know their students. They had no kind of communication with their students. They didn't know who they were. And so they could fall back on that old canard. These are not our students. These are people from off campus.
Right.
And that's not really accurate. And I know that the mayor of New York has said that, but it's actually, if you look at the statistics about what happened at most of the campus protests, even in New York City, it was mostly students, faculty, or recent graduates.
Right.
So again, I think the presidents didn't handle it well. I also think that there have to be expectations of how people deal with one another as members of a community, and also a recognition that free speech actually does matter on our campuses.
Right.
I mean, I think free speech really does matter. And yes, some of the things that were said would have been hurtful to me, but unless they're really threatening to hurt me, or hurt my students physically, they're saying it does not make it a disciplinary action. I don't.
I think speech is fine. The problem I had is the encampments. You do not have a First Amendment right to set up tents that all look alike. Who bought them? That's a question. But you don't have the First Amendment right.
So you want me to set up tents? You just want them to be different colors?
Yeah,
to set up tents and to take over a university.
Well, there have been encampments for protests in the United States since the protests during the Depression. So
it doesn't mean you have to allow it.
That's not a new thing. So
but it doesn't mean you have to allow it.
I do think that one point, speaking legally, there's actually a pretty good First Amendment argument that you have the right to do most of this stuff on expressive speech grounds. Like you can say pretty much any damn thing that's not obscenity, fraud, direct incitement to crime. Like we all know the rules here. I guess the argument with universities is how this sudden discovery of strong free speech rights came about. I mean, I've worked pretty extensively on the campus. Christy, as I understand, you're a lawyer by background. We're all familiar with the campus. These are universities that have anti-misgendering policies. You can't say a great variety of things. Racial slurs are described in guidelines for students with terms like the N-word. So all of a sudden, when you see university presidents in front of Congress, struggling to answer questions like, can you say kill all the Jews on campus? It takes on sort of a Monty Python-esque ambiance. Well, I mean, I think you should be able to say kill all the Jews. I think you should also be able to say, if I were in Israel's position, I would have invaded and conquered the fake-o country of Palestine, burnt every city to the ground, and killed every male over 12. And the question is whether the university leadership would have allowed you to say the second thing ever. So, I mean, the question is, would you be comfortable with students saying both of those things?
Yeah, well, I think I see your point, but I think the point is not whether you can say those things as far as the president's comments are concerned. It's that when you're asked, is that an anti-Semitic comment? You should be able to say, yes, it is.
Right.
If it was.
Yeah, you can say it is, and they have a right to say it. Just say that. That's what I thought. Why didn't you just say that? But Will makes a really good point, though. That the bigger issue, because the culture has created it, is the problem that you can say some things and you can't say others.
So, I mean,
either we're consistent or we're not.
But I don't think that's exactly accurate. On the campuses that have gotten the most press, which are all the Ivy League campuses and UCLA maybe. Because the guy called in the police at the at the wrong time.
Right.
But at any rate, there have been these conversations where people have been able to discuss the issue across difference. And it was because they had set up methods of communication beforehand. You can't set it up in the middle of the crisis.
Right. That's
And
true.
and to Wilfred's point,
Mhm.
when did these students become so aware? And if you look at the group of students who were protesting, who are the pro-Palestinian students, it's not immediately apparent to me how they got to that perspective.
Right.
And it's this embracing of a simplistic binary understanding of victim and oppressor.
Of course, yeah.
Well, I
And
agree with
and
everything you're saying.
and that's a failure in education.
Right. Right. Someone
That's
said them
that's
those
what
lines.
that's what these
Well,
presidents didn't do. They didn't take the opportunity to figure out a way to make this into an educational experience.
well,
And
no,
that's
quite
what
right. Like we all agree with that, and I think you're giving good leadership advice. I think my point, which isn't really a question, it's just sort of a basic statement. The issue that a lot of people would have with not your institution, but with most college leadership on this, is that it's just transparently obvious that I couldn't take 100 conservative guys to UCLA and chant, say, trans women are all men. Or 100 things that the large majority of the population believes to knows are true. There would be either A, a riot, or B, us being removed from campus within 30 seconds by big unfriendly security guys.
Right.
So, I mean, like Ben Shapiro, I'm not going to defend, say, Milo Yiannopoulos here or something, although he has a right to talk. But I mean, Ben Shapiro came to, I believe that exact school is UCLA or Berkeley, and there, in fact,
Berkeley, I
was
think
a
it was.
near riot. Do you think it was Berkeley?
Mhm.
Yeah, but I mean, there was a near riot. I think 250 cops
Yeah.
were needed, 12 were injured. So, in that context, it's a bit silly to say, well, there's an ultimate right to free speech. I agree, but I'd like to see colleges enforce that across the board. You
I
should
get your
be
point.
as able to say absolutely obviously true things about biological sex or whatever else as you are to say absurd things about Jews and the conflict in the Middle East. That's all I got.
She's thinking.
It's a good thing
I
to
don't know
do.
that I have an answer to that because I'm not sure that there aren't certain things that shouldn't be said.
Well, can I give you
No, this is kind of what I'm saying. I mean, obviously, we're all lovely people. We're enjoying talking to each other, but
Right.
the idea that it's across the line to say trans women are men, which is a biological statement, but it's not to say that you should kill either all the Jews or all the Arabs is. I
I
don't even say it's
well,
not nonsensical. It's
I agree that
religious.
I agree that you I actually disagree with you. I agree that you shouldn't be able to say either.
I think you should be
I-
able to say
wait, you saying you
all.
shouldn't be able to say that a
Then the
trans woman is a man?
pro-Palestinian protesters
or
should
you
be
should
removed from
call it
campus
by what it
immediately.
is. If it's anti-Semitic, it's anti-Semitic. If it's
No, but you say that. Wait. I just want for clarity.
Oh,
You're saying that you should not be able to
well,
publicly
you should be
say.
able to call it what it is.
Oh
Not
no, but so what is
when I'm
that?
saying you shouldn't say it, I don't mean that you
Okay,
can't say it out
You
loud.
just said right,
But
right,
you
right,
should,
right.
I
Okay.
should be able to say, as the president, what you
Uh-huh.
said is anti-Semitic, or what you said is anti. I don't.
Yeah, well, what is that? That's what I was gonna say. What is okay, let me give you a real life scenario. So I'm on the school board here in New York, and we passed a resolution. We're being attacked. They just passed a resolution to remove us from office, elected position. We're saying this, not saying as hard as will trans men or women. Is that what you said? Whatever the case may be. What we said was
trans women
we
are
want to
biological men. They're all
right.
males. They have
We want
penises.
to we all we said was we wanted to revisit the gender guidelines that says that a biological male who identifies as a girl gets to go through school and live as a girl. That's fine. But the guidelines also says that if he identifies as a girl, he is a girl full stop. He can do anything a girl can do. So locker room access and competitive sports. So we're saying we should revisit the guidelines that would allow a biological boy to join the girls' volleyball football team. Reevaluate the guideline. To that, they said we're not allowed to say that we are racist and homophobic and voted to remove us from our elected office. That is a real life thing that actually happened without anybody saying trans women or women or kill the Jews. And they are saying that we are not allowed to say that. So we need to be removed from office. That is not
I
okay.
think that's a problem.
Right.
No, that is not okay.
Right. So that's what I think that's what we're really saying. Same thing on the college campuses where you could. So yeah, Will is, I'm not saying the things Will says never happen, but that's more extreme cases. But people will say, be a student out of college and get expelled for calling a black student a nigger. I don't
Yeah,
think it's right, but I don't think you should get expelled, especially unless this is a series of, like anything else in your job, you would have progressive discipline where
You're
you
just
get a
and that's
being
verbal
one
exactly
standard.
one of the things I wrote right as things were blowing up in the fall. I wrote an article for the San Diego Jewish World about what I thought we should have learned before with regard to dealing with protests and disagreements on campuses. And one of the things I said was that what presidents and administrative teams ought to do is to spend some time over the summer, because it's going to come back in the fall. You know it is. And particularly with the election going on, it's going to come back with a fervor. Reviewing all of their disciplinary procedures and all of their procedures with regard to protests, including the question that Christy mentioned earlier about encampments. And make sure that you have in place procedures that make sense and disciplinary action that makes sense. So to Charles's point, if someone just uses, kill the Jews or, kill the Zionists or whatever they say, one time, the idea that that person should be expelled is outrageous. If you are going to have that as something that you're going to discipline, there ought to be some kind of progressive discipline or some kind of reasonable response. In addition to that, don't bring in the police the first time you have a student protest.
Right.
I mean, you will by necessity make it that you can't communicate with anyone. And one of the things that disturbed me the most about how there were many things that disturbed me about the congressional hearings, but one of the things that disturbed me the most was the criticism of the presidents who actually sat down and spoke to their students. And they were criticized for doing that. That's exactly what the president should have been doing from the beginning.
Right. Got you. Well, I know your book is, we're close to the end of time here. Your book ends on, you talk about these lessons learned, and the last ones are the rough ones, lessons learned from loss and pain, and how you can, those things are difficult, but you learn from those. And you talk about medical issues. You talk about a colleague's, really bad suicide. It was a woman with a gun, which is rare.
Yeah.
And you're not becoming an opera singer. So talk about some of those difficult things and, why it's important for all of us to be able to learn from those challenges.
Well, all of us have challenges, and all of us end up experiencing things that we wish we had not. But the point is, you can either wallow in sorrow from it, or you can learn from it. And I think I became a better president because I was turned down as a opera singer. I mean, I really thought I was going to be singing at the Metropolitan Opera Company, and I unfortunately just didn't have that good a voice. To learn to overcome that, or to overcome issues of health. When you have a chronic disease and you have to learn how to live through that, how to manage your life. And most particularly losing that friend of mine whom I had no knowledge she was that depressed.
Right.
And just one day she shoots herself.
Yeah.
And the guilt that you feel afterwards is just horrific.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I mean, the book is important, and you can learn from it. And the last thing, as a former president, do you have any hopeful thoughts of what's going on in the college campuses? Will they learn?
I do.
I don't know. Will they learn from what they?
I do, and I hope college presidents will learn to be courageous and will learn to listen to people, to learn to. I do think Will's point is well taken, and that is that particularly with regard to the issues of gender and race, the conversation is almost entirely tilted to the left. Right. And if that is the case, that is not a truly fair intellectual and academic experience. And you have to be open to listening to, I mean, I remember when Trump was elected, and the students came into my office and said, well, he's not my president. And I said, oh, yes, he is. Right. He's our president.
Right.
Yes, he is.
Well, you make some
He was
points in the book.
elected. I mean, he was elected.
Yeah, you make some points in the book that show how important. And one last thing I did remember as you said that, you talked about how you talked about being a woman, being a Jew, being in the South, standing out, never fitting in. But then at one point you talk about all these people, the family members, the mentors as you build up, and then you say you look back and you realize your closest and your most long lasting mentors were all men, all white, but for one, all non-Jewish. So had you closed the door on that as assumed, well, I need a woman to show me how to get up,
I never would have made it.
where would you make it? And some people still do that today. So I think they can learn a lot from the way you navigated, which obviously would have been a far more oppressive situation for women in a far more racist country at the time you came up than now. I'm somewhat hopeful, but I am really bothered by the fact that we've raised a generation of people who think their lives and what they face culturally. I don't know. I'm not talking about a loss of a family member or a chronic illness. Just the culture and the country is so far worse than what you or even I, as a younger person, experienced when we were coming up. They think that, the country is so much more polarizing and more racist. I mean, they may be polarized politically, but not racially and in other ways. We're so open and inviting and diverse, and they think, daily life, like you see articles every day that say, Black life every day is this, and it's always described as dark.
Well, I think your point is very well taken. And one of the things that worries me the most about this generation, and I guess, Christy, you also work on a college, or
no, I used to. That was a while ago.
But I don't know if you see this, but I find the students of today have almost no resilience. And that's part of what you're seeing in these protests. They have not developed. And one of the ways, one of the lessons that I learned in my life was from my grandmother, who always thought, she said, I lived at the best time in the world. And I said, wait a minute, your mother died when you were 10. Your father kept marrying these progressively younger women, none of whom cared about you. Oh yeah. And you married a guy who sort of, lorded it over her, didn't treat her all that well, and had tuberculosis. You had to support him. And she said, yes, but I still lived in the best time in the world, because that was her attitude.
Right.
Because she learned to grow from these. And I guess the reason I'm optimistic is that I hope more people will listen to this and will help their students learn resilience. I have another book coming out in January, which is about my presidency, which is Portrait of a Presidency. So I hope you'll read that. And
I hope you'll come back to talk about it.
And it has specific lessons that I think presidents ought to look at, that what I think answers some of these. Although now, after this conversation, I think I'm going to add a section about this. Conversation has been very helpful for me in thinking through how to bring in, to make sure that there really is a diversity of opinion in your cabinet. It's not who's there, it's what they think, and how they bring those thoughts.
I'm really happy to hear that. I wish more people would think like you. Unfortunately, you're no longer running a school, but you can teach some people, you can speak and mentor, because there's such a push on diversity, but they're only talking about what you look like how many women and what's the tone of your skin. But you better think the same way, right? But
otherwise I won't hire you.
Yeah, what if somebody else has the solution to some problem? We all have something we bring to the table. Well, I appreciate the conversation and having you on, and the book. She is Barbara Gitenstein, the President Emerita of the College of New Jersey and author of Experience is the Angled Road, Memoir of an Academic. Robob, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to meet you all.
Thank you.
You too.
God get all of the praise. I got a country to save, 'cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving a day.